Yeah, I got to go now, though. Okay, see you later. All right. Hi, and welcome back to Intro to Cinema, Unit 3, where we're talking about the narrative story form. And while this is not directly discussing cinematic techniques, because we're working with the story form, it does have a tremendous amount of impact on how stories are told, especially in the Hollywood narrative tradition, now over 100 years old. Once we understand the way the story works in a film, we can start breaking down the individual technical components and see how the filmmakers use their cinematographic skills to create the imagery that helps tell the story. And of course, just like in studying literature, once we understand the story form as a paradigm or as a framework, we can better understand how all stories work, and additionally appreciate when someone is really working within the form or manipulating the form in a creative way. The basic outline of a drama goes back to Greek times and is very simple to describe. We have a setting in which the story takes place, and then a primary character or characters who roll through one of typically three kinds of conflict. And you might remember these from your high school lit class or your intro to lit class in college. And those are typically human versus human, human versus self, and human versus nature. Human versus human often pits two different human entities against one another. Could be a war film or a boxing film or a romance in which two different romantic entities are working with one another. And romance typically has its own form, but we'll talk about that in a second. Human versus self is a format in which a primary character is having a struggle within themselves, some kind of internal struggle, such as Psycho, where a person actually has mental issues going on, or a person is torn about what they should do in a given situation. And then, of course, human versus nature pits the individual versus the ocean or some animal or some other aspect of nature like a blizzard that presents the conflict for the character. So we have our setting, we have our conflict, in which the character receives their motivation. What is going to drive them through the film or through the story? Then there is a rising series of events, often known as the plot, in which a variety of things happen that challenge the character's motivation, getting to a climactic point in the story where some type of revelation happens or some type of primary character change happens. Subsequent to that, we have a wrapping up, what the French call the denouement. And while this is very much part of the Hollywood story format, it's not specifically relegated to only Hollywood films. A typical 30-minute sitcom has a very similar format. We have a familiar setting, we have familiar characters who are in some kind of conflict, and then through a series of plot developments, ultimately change their mind about something or have a revelation that leads them to think in a new way. And then we have a very final segment that wraps up all the action. Dramas work much the same way on television as well. And not every film works in this exact way. Some films have tried to manipulate the form using flashbacks to tell a story. The first great American model, of course, is Citizen Kane, in which the first scene is the primary character's death. And then the entire film is a series of flashbacks in which a reporter is motivated to determine what the character's final word, Rosebud, meant. And so he goes through a series of flashbacks in which he's not only trying to figure out what the word meant, but also what this person was all about, what the character of Kane was, so that maybe he can then find the meaning of Rosebud, which some critics have said is sort of a red herring to manipulate you through the story and have an easy twist at the end. And others have said it is just a way to provide motivation for the reporter to go through a series of flashbacks and determine what Kane was all about. Another basic narrative form in the Hollywood tradition is the romance, in which the basic format is a couple meeting, boy meets girl, falling in love, boy and girl get together, and then some sort of fight happens, boy and girl split up, and then through one of the other characters' reconciliation with what they really feel in their head, they decide that they are wrong and want to make up. Quite often, as I mentioned in Unit 1, water will be part of this change of heart and change of mind, and then they will go back to the lover they had, and the story has a happy ending. While it is an oversimplification, and some people don't necessarily like the way this is described, boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl. Or in some stories, it could be, a horse story in which a child gets a horse, child loses the horse, child gets the horse back. Or a family has a dog, loses a dog, gets the dog back. I mean, you can see how the formula will work. All of this goes back to Greek times and Greek drama, in which a primary character would go through a series of conflicts before they would have their epiphany or their epiphanical moment. One can easily think about the Odyssey and how Odysseus is filled with pride and hubris. He knows he's a natural-born hero, and he's going out to prove it. And as the story goes, the gods continue to test him and throw everything at him to really try and overwhelm his pride. And then ultimately he does have a moment where he realizes that he's nothing without the gods, and that's his epiphanical moment. The primary way a story works is to have a setting, character or characters, introduction, one of three types of conflicts: human versus human, human versus self, human versus nature, from which the character achieves his or her primary motivation to start proceeding through the plot and the moments in which things are happening that starts to shape how they are feeling about their situation, up to the climactic point or moment in which the character has a revelation or primary change within themselves, a moment of understanding, an epiphanical moment or an epiphany. Subsequent to that, the falling action known as the denouement or the wrapping up. And most Hollywood stories work in this way. The one thing that's unique is when a writer adds a twist just before the climax or just after the climax to shake us up a little bit and entertain us with a concept in the story that we hadn't really thought about, but in retrospect makes sense. And that's why good films always reward repeated viewings, because once you see a film that has a twist and watch the film again, you can see the foreshadowing early on that projects that ultimate twist that happens toward the end of the story. And that's what makes watching films or reading stories fun. So we'll leave it at that for today and Unit 3, which is about narrative in film.